Late one night in Arlington, Virginia, the quiet hum of the suburbs was shattered by flashing blue and red lights. Talia Porter, driving her sleek black SUV, was pulled over by officers Brandon Carter and Mark Sullivan. What began as a seemingly routine traffic stop quickly escalated into something far more sinister. Talia, a woman with an instinct for detail honed by years of undercover fieldwork, had noticed the officers' deliberate movements and the almost rehearsed quality of their accusations. They claimed she'd failed to stop at a sign, a violation she knew she hadn't committed. As Carter's flashlight beam swept across her face, she calmly retrieved her license and registration. Carter's initial authority shifted to a more pointed scrutiny as he processed her information. Virginia plates, local address, the details seemed to pique his interest. Then Sullivan, lingering near the rear of her SUV, called out to Carter, his voice low and conspiratorial. A glance passed between the two officers, and a flicker of unease went through Talia. It wasn't fear, but a sharp, instinctual warning. Carter returned to her window, his expression now grim. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am," he ordered. Talia tilted her head slightly, her voice calm but questioning. "May I ask why, officer?" "We have reason to believe you're in possession of illegal substances," Carter replied, his tone clipped, almost rehearsed. Talia's eyes narrowed. "Illegal substances?" she repeated. "I think you've made a mistake." "We'll see about that," Carter said, gesturing for her to exit. Sullivan, a smug look plastered across his face, was already waiting near the back of her SUV. Suppressing a sigh, Talia opened the door and stepped out. Her movements were unhurried, deliberate, as though she had all the time in the world. This wasn't her first rodeo. She knew how these things could escalate, especially for a black woman. She kept her hands visible and her posture relaxed, but her mind was racing, trying to understand what was happening. She had been so careful, so meticulous. How could they possibly have anything on her? As she walked toward the back of the SUV, she noticed Sullivan pointing at something in the trunk. It was a small, nondescript package. Her heart sank. She hadn't packed anything like that. This was a setup, a carefully orchestrated trap. But by whom and why? Carter's voice boomed, interrupting her thoughts. "Is this yours, ma'am?" He held up the package, his expression a mix of feigned surprise and triumph. Talia met his gaze, her own unwavering. "No, officer," she replied, her voice firm. "That is not mine. I have never seen that before in my life." Sullivan scoffed. "Don't play coy with us. We know what's going on." Talia's mind raced. They were framing her. But why? What could they possibly gain? Unless a chilling realization dawned on her, her undercover operation. Had they somehow found out? Were they trying to silence her? "I'm telling you the truth," she repeated, her voice calm but resolute. "That package does not belong to me." Carter exchanged another glance with Sullivan, a smirk playing on his lips. "We'll let the judge decide that," he said, reaching for his handcuffs. As the cold steel snapped around her wrists, Talia knew this was just the beginning. This wasn't just a simple traffic stop gone wrong. This was a calculated move, and she was caught in the middle of something much bigger, something much darker. And she had a feeling that the truth, when it finally exploded, would shake the Arlington Police Department to its core. The world. She stood with her hands at her sides, watching as Sullivan theatrically lifted the trunk and gestured toward a small, unmarked bag sitting conspicuously near the edge. "There it is," Sullivan said with mock surprise. "What do you know?" "A bag of powdery goodness." Talia's eyes flicked to the bag and then back to the officers, her face unreadable. Inside, though, her mind was working rapidly, cataloguing every detail. The bag hadn't been there when she left her house. She was sure of it. This was a setup. Carter moved closer, his smirk widening. "Anything you want to tell us, ma'am?" Talia's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, a subtle, calculated expression that conveyed neither fear nor guilt. "I'll save my comments for the appropriate setting," she said. Carter chuckled, clearly interpreting her calm as arrogance. "Oh, you'll have your chance. You're under arrest for possession with intent to distribute." As Sullivan moved to cuff Talia, she allowed it, her gaze steady and unflinching. "You're making a big mistake," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet intensity that made Sullivan pause for half a second before snapping the cuffs into place. "Yeah, we'll see," Carter said, leading her toward the squad car. "Let's see how confident you are in front of a judge." As they drove away, Talia gazed out the window, her mind already spinning through her options. The two officers might think they had just scored an easy arrest, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. The ride to the station was shrouded in a tense silence. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the police radio. Talia sat in the back seat of the patrol car, her hands cuffed behind her, her expression neutral. The fluorescent glow of passing streetlights painted fleeting shadows across her face, but her gaze remained fixed on the road ahead. Inwardly, her thoughts were sharp, deliberate. Every moment of the encounter replayed in her mind, like a puzzle being assembled piece by piece. The stop sign that didn't exist, the officer's smug confidence, the planted bag. It wasn't just a random act of corruption. It was calculated, rehearsed. These weren't mistakes. They were choices. Officer Carter glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "You don't seem too worried," he said, breaking the silence. His voice carried an edge of mockery, as if he were trying to provoke her. Talia met his eyes through the mirror, her gaze steady, unflinching. "Should I be?" Carter chuckled, shaking his head. "You're either brave or stupid, lady. I've seen a lot of people act tough, but it never lasts long in the holding cell." Talia didn't respond. She didn't need to. She knew men like Carter all too well, used to power, to bending the rules to their advantage, to walking away without consequence. For now, she let him believe he was in control. That illusion wouldn't last. The station was quiet when they arrived. The night shift officers were lounging behind their desks, sipping coffee and chatting in low voices. Carter and Sullivan led Talia inside, the fluorescent lights casting an unforgiving glare on the scuffed linoleum floors and peeling paint of the walls. "Got ourselves a big one tonight," Carter announced, his voice loud and brash. The other officers glanced up, their interest piqued. Sullivan tossed the bag of powder onto the counter with a theatrical flourish. "Caught her red-handed," Sullivan added. "Looks like she's been running more than stop signs." Talia remained silent, her gaze sweeping the room. She noted the placement of every camera, the layout of the desks, and the casual camaraderie among the officers. It was a small station, the kind where everyone knew everyone, a network of shared secrets and unspoken codes. They guided her to a fingerprinting station, where Carter removed the cuffs and motioned for her to place her hands on the ink pad. She complied without a word, her movements calm and deliberate. The officer working the station, a younger man with tired eyes, hesitated as he glanced at her as though sensing something was off. "Name?" he asked, his tone almost apologetic. "Talia Porter," she replied evenly. "Occupation?" Talia hesitated for the briefest moment, considering her answer. "Consultant," she said finally. It was vague enough to pass scrutiny, but true enough to avoid outright deception. The younger officer nodded and continued typing, his unease evident. Carter and Sullivan, however, were oblivious, laughing quietly as they leaned against the counter, enjoying the show. Talia asked, her voice cutting through their laughter like a blade. Both men turned toward her, their smugness faltering for a split second. "You've got a smart mouth," Carter said, his tone darkening. "Let's see how funny you are after a night in lockup." Talia's cell was cold and dimly lit. The metal bench bolted to the wall offered little comfort. The bars cast long shadows across the concrete floor, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. She sat on the bench, her back straight, her posture unyielding. The door slammed shut behind her, echoing through the quiet corridor. Carter lingered for a moment, watching her with a mix of curiosity and disdain. "You don't look like the type to get mixed up in this kind of thing," he said, almost conversationally. "But don't worry. The courts love a good sob story. Maybe they'll go easy on you." Talia tilted her head slightly, her gaze locking onto his. "Or maybe they'll see through yours," she said, her tone calm but laced with an edge that made Carter shift uncomfortably. He muttered something under his breath and walked away, leaving her alone in the cell. Talia leaned back against the cold metal wall, exhaling slowly. She knew her next steps had to be precise. She wasn't just fighting for her own freedom. She was about to expose something much bigger. The quiet of the cell was broken only by the faint hum of the station's HVAC system. Talia waited, her patience born of years in the field. She knew her absence would be noticed soon enough, and when it was, there would be questions. Her team would find her. They always did. In the meantime, she had to play the part, the calm detainee, the unremarkable woman with nothing to hide. But every passing moment was another opportunity to observe, to gather information. She noted the footsteps of the night shift officers as they passed her cell, their routines and patterns. She listened for the faint beeping of the station's computers and the crackle of the radio. Every detail mattered. When the time came, she would be ready. In the station's break room, Carter and Sullivan sat back with steaming mugs of coffee, their laughter filling the small space. "She thinks she's untouchable," Sullivan said, shaking his head. "Did you see her face? Not even a flicker of panic." "Yeah, well, that'll change," Carter replied, a smirk playing at his lips. "She's just another name in the system now. Nobody's going to dig too deep. Besides," Sullivan added, "we've got everything we need. The evidence is airtight." Neither of them noticed the young officer from the processing desk lingering nearby, his face pale and his eyes darting toward the holding cells. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right with him, but he kept his mouth shut. In this station, questioning senior officers wasn't just frowned upon, it was dangerous. Back in her cell, Talia closed her eyes, her breathing steady. The hours ticked by, but she didn't sleep. She didn't need to. Every minute was another step closer to the moment when everything would come crashing down. The storm was coming, and Talia was its quiet eye. A pale sliver of dawn filtered through the narrow, high-placed window of Talia's holding cell. The light cast a muted glow on the cold concrete walls, signaling the start of a new day. Talia hadn't moved much during the night, sitting upright on the metal bench, her eyes half closed as if in meditation. Sleep was a luxury she rarely indulged in during missions. Her mind was sharper this way, constantly calculating, anticipating. The faint hum of voices drifted from the hallway outside her cell. The station was coming to life, the day shift officers beginning their routines. She listened carefully, noting the distinct tones and footsteps, little tells that revealed more about the people working there. A loud buzz signaled the unlocking of the cell block door, followed by heavy boots echoing down the corridor. Talia didn't flinch as Officer Sullivan appeared in front of her cell, holding a clipboard and wearing his usual smirk. "Morning, sunshine," he said, his voice dripping with mocked cheerfulness. "You sleep okay, or was the cot not star enough for you?" Talia met his gaze without a word, her silence unsettling him more than he'd care to admit. He shifted his weight slightly, glancing down at his clipboard. "You've got a bail hearing this afternoon," he said, tapping the paper with his pen. "But between you and me, I wouldn't get your hopes up. Judges around here don't take too kindly to drug traffickers." She tilted her head, her expression calm but unyielding. "Good to know," she replied softly. Sullivan frowned, the confidence in his smirk faltering for a split second. He cleared his throat and stepped back. "Enjoy your breakfast," he muttered before turning on his heel and walking away. Talia leaned back against the wall, her gaze following him as he disappeared down the hallway. The cracks in their facade were starting to show. All she needed was a little more time. At the front desk, Officer James Keller, young, eager, and fresh out of the academy, watched Sullivan stride through the station. Something about the whole situation still didn't sit right with Keller. He'd processed dozens of arrests in his few months on the job, but this one felt different. The suspect, Talia Porter, hadn't acted like anyone Keller had ever seen. She wasn't defiant or aggressive, but she wasn't scared either. Her calm demeanor, her deliberate words, they weren't normal. And then there was the bag of drugs. It was almost too convenient, sitting right there in the trunk like a gift-wrapped package. Keller hesitated, his fingers hovering over his keyboard. The unwritten rules of the station. You didn't question senior officers. But the doubt gnawed at him, and he couldn't shake it. He glanced at the surveillance monitors mounted above his desk, the live feed showing the hallway outside Talia's cell. She was sitting on the bench, still as a statue, her expression unreadable. Keller bit his lip, a tiny spark of resolve flickering within him. While Keller wrestled with his conscience, Talia made her move. Her hands rested casually in her lap, but her sharp eyes were trained on the camera positioned outside her cell. It was an old model, likely outdated and poorly maintained. The station's budget, she guessed, didn't prioritize state-of-the-art surveillance. She waited until the hallway was clear, then shifted slightly on the bench, her movements deliberate but subtle. Hidden in the hem of her jacket was a small, inconspicuous tracker, standard issue for CIA operatives in the field. She pressed her hand against the fabric, triggering the device with a barely perceptible click. The tracker sent a silent signal, a beacon that would reach her team within moments. She didn't need to speak or explain. They would know what to do. In the break room, Carter and Sullivan sipped their coffee, laughing over the morning paper. "She's probably sitting in there thinking we're going to crack," Carter said, shaking his head. "They always think they can talk their way out of it." Sullivan chuckled. "Yeah, well, she's in for a rude awakening. This case is a slam dunk. We've got the drugs, the arrest report, and no witnesses. Nobody's coming to save her." Carter leaned back in his chair, a satisfied grin on his face. "You know what I like about this job? The predictability. You see the same types over and over. They think they're smarter than us, but they never are." Their laughter echoed through the room, oblivious to the storm brewing just beyond their understanding. At a nearby office, a nondescript phone buzzed softly on a desk. A hand reached out to answer it. The voice on the other end, calm but authoritative, said, "Signal received. Location confirmed, deploying resources." Talia leaned her head back against the wall, her eyes closing for a brief moment. She could almost feel the gears turning, the quiet precision of her team mobilizing in the background. Every second that passed brought her closer to the inevitable reckoning. She opened her eyes and smiled faintly, the kind of smile that held no joy, only quiet certainty. The officers had no idea what was coming. The station bustled with its usual morning activity. Officers were filing reports, answering calls, and exchanging pleasantries over coffee. It was business as usual for everyone except Talia Porter and the two men who had orchestrated her arrest. For Carter and Sullivan, today felt like a victory lap. Talia sat motionless in her holding cell, her posture as composed as ever. Through the bars, she could see the edges of the station's activity, the occasional passing shadow, snippets of conversation. But she remained focused. She knew how to blend into the background when necessary, to make herself invisible until the exact moment when visibility mattered most. Her signal had been sent hours ago, and she trusted her team implicitly. But she also knew they wouldn't act immediately. Timing was critical. In the meantime, she needed to sow the seeds of doubt. At the front desk, Officer Keller's eyes darted toward the holding cell monitors again. Talia hadn't moved much since her arrival, but something about her demeanor gnawed at him. It wasn't fear or defiance, two emotions he was accustomed to seeing in detainees. It was patience, a quiet confidence that seemed misplaced for someone accused of trafficking drugs. Unable to shake his unease, Keller pulled up her file on his computer. Her driver's license information and address were straightforward, but there was an unusual gap in her employment history. The system flagged her most recent job as independent consultant with no further details. Frowning, Keller minimized the file and glanced toward the break room, where Carter and Sullivan were laughing over donuts. Their carefree demeanor made his stomach churn. Against his better judgment, Keller decided to take a closer look at the arrest report. Clicking through the digital records, he scanned the narrative provided by Carter and Sullivan. Stopped for failure to yield at a marked intersection, Keller muttered under his breath, reading aloud. Driver exhibited nervous behavior during questioning. Consent to search granted. Controlled substances found in the trunk of the vehicle. Something didn't add up. He'd been trained to recognize patterns of deception, and while the report followed procedure on the surface, it felt too tidy, too scripted. Keller's internal conflict grew as the hours passed. He found himself pacing near the holding cells, glancing toward Talia's cell with increasing frequency. Finally, he worked up the courage to speak. "Miss Porter," he said, stopping just outside the bars. Talia looked up, her dark eyes sharp and assessing. "Yes?" Keller hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "I just wanted to ask, did you really consent to the search of your car?" Talia tilted her head slightly, studying him. She could see the doubt in his eyes, the faint cracks in his resolve. "What do you think, Officer Keller?" she asked, her tone calm but pointed. Keller swallowed hard. I'm just doing my job," he said, his voice faltering. "That's what they're counting on," Talia replied, her gaze steady. "Men like Carter and Sullivan, they rely on people like you to look the other way." Keller's face flushed and he stepped back, stammering something unintelligible before retreating down the hall. But Talia saw the hesitation in his steps, the conflict etched into his features. The seed had been planted. Meanwhile, in the heart of Arlington, a plain black sedan rolled to a stop outside a nondescript building. Inside, a man in a tailored suit stepped out, his movements deliberate. He was flanked by two other agents, their demeanor professional and alert. "ETA on extraction?" one of the agents asked as they entered the building. The man checked his watch, his expression unreadable. "We'll proceed when she gives the signal. For now, we watch." Inside a secure operations room, live feeds from the police station flickered across several monitors. One screen showed Talia in her cell, sitting perfectly still. Another displayed the front desk, where Keller was visibly agitated, pacing back and forth. "Looks like the kid's starting to crack," one agent observed, eyes glued to the live feed. "Good," the man replied, his voice measured, yet tinged with a certain cold satisfaction. "We'll use it when the time comes." In the break room, Carter leaned back in his chair, sipping his third cup of coffee. "You see Keller earlier?" he said to Sullivan, his voice tinged with amusement. Kid looked like he'd seen a ghost. Sullivan smirked, shaking his head, probably overthinking things, fresh out of the academy. They always get jumpy around the first big case. "Yeah, well, let's hope he doesn't start asking too many questions," Carter said, his tone darkening, a shadow passing over his otherwise confident expression. Sullivan shrugged dismissively. "Doesn't matter. The evidence is all there and she's got no alibi. Even if he gets nosy, there's nothing he can prove." Carter nodded, but for a moment his gaze flickered to the door as if considering something. "Yeah, but if he starts talking to the wrong people—" "Won't matter," Sullivan interrupted, his voice firm. "The case is tight. He can't do anything." But Carter's unease lingered. He considered the possibility that Keller's doubts might be contagious, spreading like a ripple in calm water, undermining the carefully laid plan. As the day wore on, the tension in the station began to rise. The mundane chatter and routine reports felt hollow to Talia, who sensed the subtle shift in the air, the growing pressure on both sides. Her team was watching, waiting, each passing minute bringing them closer to the perfect moment. She just needed to hold steady a little longer. Keller's footsteps echoed down the hall again, slower this time, hesitant. He stopped in front of Talia's cell, his face conflicted, torn between duty and the unsettling doubts he couldn't shake. "You said they're counting on people like me," he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "What did you mean by that?" Talia met his gaze with unflinching eyes. "You know exactly what I mean," she said, her voice low but steady. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Keller stared at her for a long moment, the weight of her words sinking in, but before he could respond, he turned abruptly, walking away, his shoulders tense, his mind racing. Back in the operations room, the suited man watched the exchange on the monitor with a quiet satisfaction. A faint smile tugged at his lips. "He's close," he said, the words almost a whisper of triumph. One of the agents glanced at him, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The man's smile widened, but there was a darker edge to it now. "One more push," he said, his voice rich with anticipation. "Then we turn this whole thing upside down." Keller froze, caught off guard by her voice cutting through the stillness of the station. His heart rate picked up, but he didn't turn immediately. The weight of the files, the haunting similarities between the cases, and Talia's calm, composed presence all collided in his mind. Finally, he turned, his gaze meeting hers. The subtle intensity in her eyes sent a shiver through him. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't pleading. She was simply waiting. "Officer Keller," she repeated, her tone measured, though her words carried the weight of something unsaid. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, but the words escaped before he could stop them. "What do you want, Miss Porter?" Talia leaned forward just slightly, her gaze never leaving his. "You know this isn't right. You've been asking yourself questions, haven't you?" Keller stiffened. He had been wrestling with the nagging feeling for hours, but hearing her say it aloud made it all the more real. "I'm just doing my job," he said, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Her lips curled into a faint, knowing smile, but there was no trace of malice. "And yet, you're still here, searching through the records, asking questions you're not supposed to ask. Your job," she continued, her voice soft but carrying an undeniable edge, "is to protect and serve, not to blindfold yourself to the truth." Keller clenched his fists, feeling the pressure of his internal conflict. "I didn't sign up for this," he muttered, mostly to himself. Talia's eyes softened, and for a moment she leaned back, letting the silence linger. Then, as if she had all the time in the world, she spoke again, her voice calm but carrying a weight that seemed to settle over him like a cloak. "There's always a choice, Keller. Always." For a long moment Keller said nothing. His gaze fell to the floor, then back to the file on his desk, the weight of the situation pressing on him like a vice. He had seen it all before. Officers looking the other way, evidence planted, careers built on the suffering of others. But hearing it from her, hearing the certainty in her voice, made it harder to deny the truth. The knot in his chest tightened further. He had a decision to make. Keller's fingers hovered over the keyboard, his thoughts racing. The names, the patterns, the cases, all pointing to something darker, something deeper than simple misconduct. He knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. He couldn't stand by while the system he'd joined perpetuated injustice. Talia had made that much clear. His mind raced as he pulled up a secure channel on his terminal, one that he knew was encrypted. He hesitated for a brief moment, wondering if this was the right call. He had never done something like this before. But the way Talia had looked at him, with that unwavering gaze, had shifted something inside him. He tapped in the secure contact, his hand trembling just slightly. The screen flickered for a moment before a calm, professional voice answered. "Agent Harris here." Keller swallowed. "I've got information. It's about Carter and Sullivan. I think they've been framing people, planting evidence. No, I need to get this to you. It's not just one case, it's a pattern." There was a brief silence on the other end, then a soft exhale. "We've been watching them for some time. You've done well, Officer Keller. What do you have?" Keller quickly relayed what he'd found, how the arrests seemed too neat, too perfect, the same scenario playing out over and over. Minor traffic violations escalating into drug charges, mostly with defendants from marginalized communities. He even mentioned the lack of transparency in the arrest reports and his suspicions about the chain of evidence. "You've got enough to move on them," Agent Harris said after a pause, his tone sharp but approving. "We'll take it from here. Stay low and don't let them know you're working with us." Keller felt a weight lift from his shoulders, but the responsibility was now on his hands. He glanced toward the hallway where Carter and Sullivan were walking, oblivious to the storm brewing. The path he had just chosen could cost him everything, but he couldn't go back. "Understood," Keller replied, his voice steady. As he logged off the terminal, he felt a quiet resolve settle over him. The truth was out there, and he would help bring it to light, no matter the cost. Keller opened a secure email channel and typed a message, his fingers moving faster as his resolve solidified. He attached the case files he had found, along with a note. "To whom it may concern, there's something wrong in this station. I don't know who else to turn to. Please help." He hit send, his heart pounding as the message disappeared into the void. He didn't know who would receive it, or if they would even care, but it was the first step toward doing what he knew was right. In the break room, Carter leaned back in his chair, his coffee cup resting on his knee. "You notice Keller acting weird today?" he asked, glancing at Sullivan. Sullivan shrugged. "Kids are always weird. What's he going to do? Rat us out?" Carter smirked, but his eyes narrowed. "Still keep an eye on him. Last thing we need is some rookie poking his nose where it doesn't belong." That afternoon, as the station hummed with activity, a nondescript black sedan pulled into the lot. Inside the car, Talia's team prepared for their next move. "Let's make this clean," the team leader said, adjusting his tie. "No unnecessary disruptions. We need to expose this from the inside." As they stepped out of the car, the sun glinted off their badges. FBI. Inside her cell, Talia smiled faintly. As the door to the station opened and the agents walked in, she couldn't see them from her vantage point, but she didn't need to. She knew her team had arrived. The storm was no longer brewing. It was here. The hum of the station fell into an awkward silence as the front doors opened. The agents stepped inside, their movements measured, their black suits crisp, and their badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The one in the lead, a tall man with graying hair and a stern expression, approached the front desk, his eyes scanning the room with quiet authority. Officer Keller, seated nearby, froze mid-typing. His heart began to race. He wasn't sure if it was fear or relief, or both. He watched as the lead agent leaned slightly over the desk, speaking low enough that the surrounding officers couldn't hear. The desk sergeant, a burly man with a gruff demeanor, straightened up, his hand instinctively reaching for the radio on his shoulder. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice wary. "Federal investigation," the agent replied, his voice steady and clipped. "We need access to your records and holding cells immediately." The sergeant hesitated, his brow furrowing as he exchanged a glance with a nearby officer. The FBI's sudden arrival was unusual, disruptive even, but there was no protocol for outright denial. "Fine," he muttered, gesturing toward the hallway. "Follow me." From his desk, Keller watched the exchange, his palms slick with sweat. He knew, deep down, that the email he'd sent had triggered this, but he hadn't expected a response so soon or so visible. His gaze flicked toward Carter and Sullivan, who were standing near the break room door. Their laughter had died wrist by hushed whispers and furrowed brows. Carter's eyes locked onto Keller for a split second, and the rookie quickly looked away, focusing on his screen. The air in the station had changed, thick with a tension that felt almost suffocating. Agent Daniel Price, the lead investigator, stepped into a small, dimly lit interrogation room with his team. A second agent rolled in a cart carrying a portable server and several hard drives. They wasted no time plugging into the station's network and beginning to sift through its digital archives. Price leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, watching as lines of code and file names scrolled across the monitor. "Anything?" he asked. The tech agent, a younger woman with sharp eyes, nodded. "Plenty. Their case files are riddled with inconsistencies, repeated arrests, identical narratives, gaps in procedure. This isn't just bad policing, it's systemic." Price's jaw tightened. "Pull everything. I want every record, every report, and every piece of evidence tied to those two." In her cell, Talia heard the faint murmur of activity beyond the hallway. She could feel the shift, the subtle ripple that signaled her team's presence. The waiting was almost over. She shifted slightly on the bench, her hands resting on her lap. The cuff she'd worn earlier had left faint red marks on her wrist, but she didn't pay them any mind. Her focus was on the moment ahead, the moment when the truth would no longer be hidden. In the break room, Carter paced back and forth, his coffee forgotten on the counter. Sullivan leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, watching his partner with a growing sense of unease. "You think this is about her?" Sullivan asked finally, his voice low. Carter stopped, glaring at him. "Of course it's about her. Why else would the feds be here?" Sullivan shifted uncomfortably. "You think they know?" Carter scoffed, but there was no conviction in his voice. "No! What's there to know? Everything we did was by the book." "Yeah," Sullivan muttered. "Sure." Agent Price emerged from the interrogation room, flanked by two other agents. He carried a folder filled with printed reports, the weight of evidence in his hands. He made his way through the station, his expression unreadable. As he approached the bullpen, his gaze locked onto Carter and Sullivan, who froze mid-conversation. The agents moved with purpose, positioning themselves like sentinels around the room. "Officers Brandon Carter and Mark Sullivan," Price said, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "We need to speak with you." Carter tried to play it cool, forcing a smirk as he stepped forward. "What's this about?" he asked, his tone casual. "We've got nothing to hide." Price didn't blink. "Good, then you won't mind answering a few questions." The room fell silent as the agents led the two officers toward the same interrogation room they had occupied moments earlier. Keller watched the scene unfold, his heart pounding. He could see the cracks forming in Carter's facade, the tension in Sullivan's shoulders. The once confident duo now looked more like cornered animals. Minutes later, another agent arrived at Talia's cell. The door buzzed open, and the agent stepped inside, his face neutral but his tone respectful. "Miss Porter," he said, "you're free to go." Talia stood, her movements smooth and deliberate. She met the agent's gaze, nodding slightly as she stepped out of the cell. The hallway seemed brighter now, the oppressive weight of the station lifting as she walked toward the front desk. As Talia passed by Keller's desk, their eyes met briefly. He opened his mouth to speak but hesitated. The words caught in his throat. She stopped, turning to face him fully. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice carrying an unspoken understanding. Keller's chest tightened. He gave a small nod, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. He didn't know what would come next, but for the first time since joining the force, he felt like he had done something that mattered. The interrogation room doors closed behind Carter and Sullivan, and the sound of raised voices soon followed. Talia watched from the station's entrance as the agents methodically dismantled the officers' lies. The storm she had waited for was finally here, and it was only the beginning. Inside the cramped interrogation room, Carter and Sullivan sat at a small metal table, their postures stiff. Agent Price stood across from them, his hands resting on a stack of documents. The silence stretched uncomfortably, broken only by the faint hum of the overhead light. "So," Price began, his tone measured, "do you want to start with the arrest report, or should we jump straight to the planted evidence?" Sullivan flinched, his eyes darting toward Carter. "We don't know what you're talking about," Carter said firmly, his voice laced with defiance. Price didn't flinch. Instead, he opened the folder, pulling out a series of printed photos. He slid them across the table, one by one. Images from the station's security cameras showing Carter and Sullivan holding the unmarked bag before Talia's car was searched. Carter's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "That doesn't prove anything," he said. "We were securing evidence." Price raised an eyebrow, leaning forward slightly. "Really? Because these timestamps show otherwise, and we have audio recordings, courtesy of Miss Porter's hidden surveillance device, capturing your little conversation about how easy it would be to frame her." Sullivan paled, his hands gripping the edge of the table. You can't use that," he sputtered. "That's entrapment." Price smirked, shaking his head. "No, it's justice. And it's just the tip of the iceberg. We've pulled records from your past arrests, dozens of cases with eerily similar patterns. All of them are under review. But let me make one thing clear. You're not walking out of here today." Carter's bravado began to crumble, his shoulders sagging. Sullivan buried his face in his hands, the weight of their actions finally hitting them. Meanwhile, in the bullpen, Keller sat at his desk, watching the scene unfold. He had been called into the interrogation room earlier to confirm details about the station's processes. For the first time, he felt the heavy gaze of Carter and Sullivan as they realized someone from within had spoken. As the agents returned to the bullpen, Keller stood, his hands trembling slightly. He approached Agent Price, clearing his throat. "What happens now?" he asked. Price looked at him, his expression softening slightly. "Now we clean house," he said. "And you," he paused, studying Keller's face, "you did the right thing." Keller nodded, a small wave of relief washing over him. For the first time since joining the force, he felt a sense of purpose. Talia stood near the station's entrance, watching as Carter and Sullivan were led out in handcuffs. The once smug officers now looked defeated, their eyes downcast as they were escorted past their colleagues. The station buzzed with quiet murmurs, officers exchanging stunned glances as the reality of the situation sank in. Agent Price approached Talia, his expression neutral but respectful. "We've got everything we need," he said. "Your work here is done." Talia nodded, her composure unbroken. "Good. Make sure it sticks," Price smiled faintly. "It will." As Talia stepped outside, the crisp air hit her face, carrying with it a sense of finality. The weight she had carried for weeks began to lift, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of knowing justice had been served. In the days that followed, the fallout from the investigation sent shock waves through the town. Carter and Sullivan's arrests were headline news, their faces plastered across every screen. The charges against Talia were formally dropped, and the cases tied to the officers' misconduct were reopened. The station underwent a massive overhaul, with several officers resigning under scrutiny. Keller, now viewed as a whistleblower, received mixed reactions from his colleagues, but he held his head high, knowing he had made the right choice. Weeks later, Talia sat on a park bench, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. The autumn leaves rustled around her, their vibrant colors a reminder of change. She had returned to her quiet life, her mission complete, but the experience lingered in her mind. Agent Price joined her, his presence a rare moment of camaraderie. "You could have handled this differently," he said, sitting down beside her. Talia smirked, taking a sip of her coffee. "And missed the look on their faces?" "No thanks." Price chuckled softly. "You've got a knack for making things memorable." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the weight of their work momentarily forgotten. For Talia, the storm had passed, but the impact of her actions would ripple on, ensuring that justice prevailed, at least for now. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours of Carter and Sullivan's arrest, every local and national outlet had picked up the story. Police corruption exposed. FBI takes down dirty cops in Arlington, read the bold headline on one major news site. Footage of the officers being led out in handcuffs played on a loop, their faces grim, stripped of the arrogance they had worn so openly. Talia Porter's name was kept out of the media intentionally, a calculated decision by her team. The focus needed to remain on the systemic issues at the station and the actions of the officers involved, not on her role in uncovering the truth. She preferred it that way. She had no interest in fame, only results. In a sterile, windowless interrogation room at a federal detention center, Carter and Sullivan sat across from their lawyers. Their arrogance had melted into desperation, replaced by the grim reality of their situation. The charges against them were overwhelming, falsifying reports, planting evidence, and abusing their authority in dozens of cases. "This is bad," Sullivan muttered, his voice shaking. "They've got everything. Audio, video, the files. What do we do?" Carter, usually the more confident of the two, sat in silence, his jaw clenched. "We fight it," he said finally, though the conviction in his voice was weak. But their lawyers weren't optimistic. The mountain of evidence was insurmountable, and public outrage had already tipped the scales against them. Plea bargains were their only chance of avoiding decades in prison. Back at the Arlington Police Department, the fallout continued. Internal investigations revealed more officers involved in similar practices, and resignations poured in as higher-ups scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. The chief of police held a press conference emphasizing a commitment to transparency and reform, but the damage to the department's reputation was already done. Keller found himself at the center of attention, both praised and ostracized for his role in bringing the corruption to light. Some colleagues avoided him, their loyalty to the old guard still intact, while others quietly expressed their support. Keller didn't care. He had done what was right, and that was enough. After her release, Talia met Keller in a small diner on the outskirts of town. The atmosphere was quiet, almost serene, a stark contrast to the chaos they had both endured. Keller sat across from her, fidgeting with his coffee cup. "I wasn't sure you'd show up," he admitted, his voice low. Talia raised an eyebrow, a faint smile playing on her lips. "You earned this conversation," she said. "Not many people would have done what you did." Keller looked down at the table, his expression conflicted. I couldn't keep looking the other way," he said. "But honestly, I don't know if it made a difference. The department's still a mess, and people like Carter and Sullivan, there are more of them out there." "It made a difference to the people they hurt," Talia replied firmly. "And it made a difference to you. Don't underestimate that." Her words seemed to ease some of his tension, and for the first time, he allowed himself a small smile. "What about you?" he asked. "What happens now?" Talia leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "I move on to the next mission. There's always another fight." Months later, Carter and Sullivan stood in court, their fates sealed. They pled guilty to multiple charges, each receiving a lengthy prison sentence. Their careers were over, their reputations destroyed. For the first time, they faced the consequences of their actions. The cases they had built on lies were overturned, and innocent people were exonerated. Community leaders rallied for deeper reforms, using the scandal as a catalyst for change. In a quiet moment, Talia sat in her sparsely furnished apartment, packing a small bag. A dossier lay open on the table, filled with details of her next assignment. She glanced at it briefly before closing it, her mind already focused on the road ahead. The phone on the counter buzzed, and she picked it up. Agent Price's voice came through the line. "Ready for the next one?" Talia smiled faintly. Always. As she stepped out to the crisp evening air, the door clicked shut behind her. The fight wasn't over, not for her, not for the people she worked to protect. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Justice had been served and the truth had prevailed, and that, for her, was enough. And so, the truth came to light, and justice was served. The corrupt officers who thought they could get away with their crimes faced the consequences of their actions, while the woman they tried to frame emerged victorious, stronger than ever. This story reminds us that no matter how deep the lies, the truth will always find a way to shine through. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more gripping tales like this, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support means the world and helps bring these stories to life. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.